Hello, it's Amy, and I'm back after a little reading hiatus with the Memoirs of the Princesse de Ligne. If you can recall from, I think it's almost been 3 or 4 weeks, but from 3 or 4 weeks ago, we were on Volume 2 of Part 2, about to read Chapter 6. So here we go. The prince had not spoken lightly when he said to his son that they would go to Poland for the indignat, and we have a footnote here. The indignat, though differing from naturalization, conferred on those who obtained it all the privileges belonging to those indigenous to the soil. In the midst of all the pleasures and amusements of Versailles, he suddenly departed. Family interests, he said, obliged me to undertake a long journey. My son Charles has married a pretty little Pole, but her family has given us paper in lieu of hard cash. Their claims were on the Russian court. It was necessary to go and present them. In June 1780, I started for Vienna, Prague, Dresden, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Warsaw, Krakow, where I had much to do, Moglany, Leopold, and Brunn, where I was in love. I must not forget to add that I started from Paris and the Rue de Bourbon from the house of the Duchess de Polignac, who had just been confined. And we have a footnote. The Duchess had given birth to Count Armand Jules de Polignac on 14 May 1780, and where I had dined with the Queen. I promised to return at the same hour in 6 months' time, and ordered my livery coach and courier in consequence. The sum of money the Prince de Ligne claimed in the name of his daughter-in-law was considerable. It amounted to 400,000 rubles, which were well worth the trouble of recovering. However, we inclined to the belief that these family affairs were merely a cloak for political designs. The journey was probably intended to carry on the preliminaries of a negotiation begun by Joseph II and the Empress Catherine in their interview at Molev. The prince started from Vienna, whither he had gone to receive his final instructions. His companions on the journey were his son Charles and his friend, the Chevalier de Isle. I made de Isle a colonel, he says, by simply saying, when in Austria, Prussia, Poland, and Russia, that he was one, and buying him a pair of epaulets. I was also obliged to knight him, he adds, in order to distinguish him in foreign parts from the Abbé of the same name. And we have another footnote. The Abbé de Lille, born at Aix-Perce on 22nd June 1728, died in Paris on May 1st, 1813. He was a member of the French Academy and as a poet enjoyed European celebrity. Though spelt differently, the name was pronounced in the same way. The prince started on their journey a year after the War of the Bavarian Succession had ended. This war entailed on the King of Prussia a large expenditure of men, horses, and money. It procured him an appearance of honesty and disinterestedness and some political amenities, but it brought him no military honor and caused him to entertain very bitter feelings towards us. Without any apparent reason, the king forbade Austrian officers to enter his dominions without a special permit signed by him. The Austrian court retaliated by making the same rule with regard to Prussian officers. This gave rise to mutual discomfort without reason or profit. Being of a confiding nature, I thought I could do without a permit, but the desire to have a letter from the great Frederick, rather than the fear of being badly received, induced me to write to him. Instead of one letter, the Prince de Ligne received 3, all charming. For fear of missing him, the king had written from Potsdam to Vienna, Dresden, and Berlin. The travelers arrived at Potsdam on the 28th of June. And I'm just noticing, interspersed here are direct quotes. And so it could be a little bit confusing as I'm reading it aloud, as we're bouncing back and forth between the quoted words of the prince, which I'm assuming are from a letter or a diary of his own, and the words of our narrator. So any sentence where the word I is in this section would be the words of the prince. And perhaps moving forward here, I can verbally tell you when a quote is beginning and when it ends. And so this is beginning a quote from the prince. Having to wait until 12 o'clock, at which hour I was to be presented to the king, together with my son Charles and Monsieur de Ile, I went to the parade ground and was surrounded and escorted by Austrian deserters, especially those from my own regiment, who tried to fawn upon me and ask my forgiveness for having left me. The hour for the presentation arrived, and the king received me in the most charming fashion. The military stiffness of headquarters was exchanged for a tender and benevolent welcome. He said he did not know I had so old a son. He has even been married a year, sire. May I ask to whom? To a Pole, Masolski. What, a Masolski? Do you know what her grandmother did? No, sire, replied Charles. She fired off the cannon at the siege of Dantic. She fired and made them fire and defended the place, when her party, who had lost their heads, only thought of yielding. Women are unaccountable creatures, said I, strong and weak by turns, cautious and dissimulating. They are capable of anything. No doubt, said Monsieur de Ile, annoyed at not having been spoken to, and he added, with a familiarity which met with no success, see, for instance. The king interrupted him at the end of half a second. In order to satisfy de Ile, I told the king that Monsieur de Voltaire had died in his arms, so that the king asked him a few questions. He answered rather too lengthily and went away. Charles and I remained for dinner. Every day the king had long conversations with me, often of 5 hours at a time, and completely fascinated me. Fine arts, war, medicine, literature, and religion, philosophy, moral philosophy, history, and legislation were all reviewed in turn. The great eras of Augustus and Louis XVI, the refined society of the Romans, the Greeks and the Franks, the chivalry of Francis I, the frankness and valor of Henry IV, the revival of learning, anecdotes of clever men of former days and their failings, Voltaire's errors, Murturus's irritability, and I know not what else. In fact, anything and everything. The most varied and wittiest things were said by the king in a soft, low, and agreeable voice, with an inexpressibly graceful movement of the lips. The charm of his manner was, I think, the reason why one did not notice that, like Homer's heroes, he was rather a babbler, though certainly a sublime one. His eyes, always too hard in his portraits, although strained with work and the fatigues of war, softened in their expression when listening to or relating some noble deed or trait of sensibility. One morning, as I arrived at the palace, the king came forward and said, I fear I must be the bearer of bad news. I have just heard that Prince Charles of Lorraine is dying. He looked to see what effect the news would have on me, and seeing the tears fall from my eyes, he gradually and gently changed the conversation. The next day, the moment he saw me, the king came up and said with an air of the deepest concern, Since you must hear of the death of a man who loved you and honored mankind, it is better that it should be through someone who feels it as sincerely as I do. Poor Prince Charles is no more. He was deeply affected as he said these words. And we have the end of the quote here, moving back to our narrator. After a conversation during which the king had spoken unceasingly for nearly an hour, the prince, finding the part of the listener rather monotonous, seized upon an allusion to Virgil and said, What a grand poet, sire, what a bad gardener. Or maybe we still are in his... I don't even know where we're at. I'm not even sure whether some of this stuff is the narrator or whether it is the prince's writings, because now we have double sets of quotes here. So I think we're still in the prince's, the Prince de Ligne's quoted paragraphs here. What a grand poet, sire, but what a bad gardener. How true. Did I not try to plant, sow, and dig and hoe, with the Georgics as my guide? But sire, the gardener used to say, not knowing who I was, you are a fool, and your book also. It is not so that one sets to work. Good heavens, what a climate, would you believe it? God and the sun refuse me everything. Look at my oranges, olive, and lemon trees. They are all dying of hunger. Laurels, I see, are the only trees that will grow for your majesty. The king gave me a delighted look, and to cap my insipid remark with a bit of nonsense, I quickly added, And then, sire, there are too many grenadiers in this country. They swallow up everything. and grenadiers in French signifying both the soldier and the pomegranate tree. The king laughed, for it is only nonsense that makes one laugh. The prince knew that the king could not bear Monsieur de Reed, and that it was because the latter had mentioned the taking of Berlin by Marshal Haddock, and that the king had conceived such a dislike for him. Therefore, when Frederick asked him if he had found Berlin much altered, he took care not to remind him that he was one of those who took possession of it in 1760. He was pleased with my reticence, for he was an old wizard who guessed everything and whose tact was the finest that ever existed. The prince asked him a bold question when speaking about France. Now that must be our narrator interjecting here. There is everything, sire, in this country, and it really deserves to be happy. It is reported that your majesty had said that if one wished to have a happy dream, one ought— Yes, interrupted the king, that is true, one ought to be king of France. After spending a delightful fortnight at Potsdam, the princes took leave of the King of Prussia with regret and continued their journey, arriving at St. Petersburg in the month of August. The Empress received the Prince de Ligne with the greatest distinction. She was already acquainted with him through Voltaire's letters and the accounts of the Emperor Joseph. Catherine found him worthy of all the praise she had heard of him, and writes, "We have also the Prince de Ligne, who is one of the most amusing and easy beings to get on with I have ever seen. Though an original and deep thinker, he has yet all the gaiety of a child. His company would suit me very well." On his part, the prince was charmed with Catherine the Great, as he called her, and thanks to his account, we have a living portrait of the Tsarina. It was easy to see that she had been handsome rather than pretty. The majesty of her brow was softened by a pleasant look and a smile, but it showed all the force of her character and revealed her genius, justice, judgment, courage, equanimity, gentleness, calmness, and firmness. Her chin, though rather pointed, did not exactly project, nor was it a receding chin, but one nobly proportioned. The oval of her face was not good, and yet it was pleasing, for the expression of her mouth was full of frankness and mirth. She must have had a fresh complexion and a fine bust, which, however, she got at the cost of her figure. She had been almost too slight, but one becomes very stout in Russia. She was clean, and if her hair had not been drawn so far back, but allowed to surround her face, she would have been better looking. One did not notice she was small. When she told me in a slow manner that she had been very vivacious, it seemed impossible to realize it. On entering a drawing-room, she always made the same 3 bows, like a man in the Russian style, one to the right, one to the left, and the other in the middle. Everything about her was measured and methodical. The prince had already become very intimate with Catherine at the end of a few days. "What did you suppose I would be like?" she asked me. "I fancied your majesty tall, stiff as a poker, with eyes like stars, and a large hoop. I thought also I should only have to admire, and constant admiration is very fatiguing. Is it not true that you did not expect to find me so stupid? In truth, I thought it would be necessary to have all one's wits about one, that your majesty allowed yourself all license, and was a perfect firework of wit, but I infinitely prefer your careless style of conversation, which becomes sublime when treating of noble passages of history, or examples of sensibility or greatness." And the Empress heartily laughed at this clever mingling of frankness and flattery. It was this contrast of simplicity in what she said with the great deeds she performed that made her interesting. A trifle amused her, she was pleased at the smallest joke, and cleverly turned it to account. One day I told her that to silence the reproaches of a lady who was displeased with my scarcity of talk, and looking bored in her house, I replied that I had just heard of the death of an aunt who had brought me up. When the Empress was bored on the grand reception days, she would say to me, "My uncle is about to die." Then I would hear it murmured, "We are going to have a mourning," and all the court would search up the uncle in the almanac, and of course not find him. However great the fascination Catherine exercised over the prince, she did not make him forget Marie-Therese, and towards the end of his stay he wrote, "The Empress Marie-Therese has certainly much greater charm and fascination. Our Empress carried one away." The impression made by the Russian Empress was much weaker at first, but gradually increased. However, they resembled each other in this, that if the universe had crumbled away, they would have been found impavadius fernent rune. No power on earth would have made them yield. Their great souls were proof against adversity. Enthusiasm preceded the one and followed the other. It was, however, necessary for the prince to tear himself away from the delights of this charming abode. But before their departure, the empress, laughing, said to the prince's father, "As you told me you would either sell, gamble, or lose any diamonds I should give you, here are only 100 rubles worth my portrait on this ring." Rubles worth... Okay. "I should give you, here are only 100 rubles worth round my portrait on this ring." So he's given her, she's given him a ring with 100 rubles worth of diamonds surrounding a portrait of herself. To this present, Catherine added jewels for the Princess de Ligne and her daughters. Prince Charles received a rich casket for Helene, and the princes left for Poland, having forgotten only one thing, viz., the claim of 400,000 rubles for which they had undertaken their journey. And we have a footnote here. It is said that Catherine's friendship for the Prince de Ligne became a warmer sentiment, and that we are disposed to believe it when we read the sour letters that Grimm wrote to the Empress about the prince of whom he was jealous. It will be seen later on that he excited Potmakin's jealousy as well. Be this as it may, the prince was very discreet on the subject, as also on that of the political conversations he had had with the Empress, for he relates nothing about them, not even in reference to Poland. We can hardly believe, however, that he did not touch upon the subject. The Princess Charles was Polish, and Catherine might well suppose that her father-in-law and husband took interest in that happy country. "For," says the prince gaily, "it seemed to me a want of delicacy to take advantage of the favour with which I was received to obtain favours." And so that is why he did not raise his claim of the 400,000 rubles. The Bishop of Wilna received the prince at his residence at Werki, a short distance from Warsaw. Werki, writes the prince, was a fortunate child of nature, a large river, 3 smaller ones, and a chain of mountains separated 2 valleys. 4 or 5 waterfalls, 3 islands, manufactories, castles, a windmill, a port, a ruin, 2 convents of handsome appearance, natural undulations, temples to Vulcan, to Bacchus, and one to Unity, which is to be erected upon piles, and a kind of bridge at the meeting of 3 pretty rivulets, an obelisk, a fisherman's and a workman's hut, bridges, some ornate, others rustic, complete the attractions of this magnificent estate. I advise and direct everything. The Dietine subdiet of Wilna had assembled to elect deputies for the Diet of Warsaw. The bishop gathered round his table 84 Polish gentlemen, nearly all wearing the national costume and having their heads shaved after the Polish fashion. Before dinner, each of them came up to salute the bishop by respectfully kissing the hem of his robe. At the end of the repast, healths were drunk. The bishop proclaimed the name of the person whose health was proposed. Then he filled an antique cup, beautifully chased, emptied it, and turned it over, showing that he had drained it to the bottom. He then passed it to his right-hand neighbor, and in this way it went round the table. These toasts were always celebrated with champagne or tokay. After an interesting sojourn at Werki and Wilna, the princess, accompanied by the bishop, started for Warsaw. We have seen that in the negotiations for the marriage of the Duke de Bolf with Helene, the Prince Bishop and the Marquis de Mirbeau had dreamt of the Polish throne for the young princess's future husband. This idea had taken possession of the bishop's brain, and the accounts that were given to him of St. Petersburg and the peculiarly cordial reception that the princess had received confirmed him in it. Persuaded that the prince was far advanced in the empress's good graces, and convinced that the king's Stalinus Augustus was no longer in favor, the bishop, ever ready to throw himself into a new adventure, took advantage of the opening of the Diet to propose the marshal as candidate for the indignant. "You will one day be king of Poland," said the enthusiastic bishop. "What a change will come over European affairs! What good luck for the Linz and Masalski!" The marshal laughed, but although he ridiculed these sayings, he allowed matters to proceed. "I had a fancy," he said, "to please the nation assembled for the Diet, and accordingly presented myself. 25 candidates came forward to obtain the ignat. 24 of them were set aside. The prince alone was retained. But it required a unanimous vote, and 3 opponents came forward. They were nearly cut down, and the violence of one of the nuncios, the Polish deputies were called nuncios, who laid his hand on his sword, uttering very threatening words, nearly broke up the diet, and my too zealous partisan had a narrow escape of losing his head. I sought my opponents. I succeeded in overcoming their prejudices, and that so thoroughly that they said, with a grace and eloquence worthy of their country, that in favor of an acquisition they considered so honourable they would, each in turn, solicit the vote of their friend. Against all custom, I rushed into the nuncio's hall and embraced the mustachios of these 3 orators. It electrified me, for I began an oration myself, in Latin too. Then I took them by the hand, and my advances resulted in a general sogda. The sogda was the cry which announced the unanimity of the vote, which rang 3 times through the hall, nearly bringing it down, so great were the universal acclamations. After having obtained the good graces of the Empress Catherine, laid out the Bishop of Wilna's gardens, gained the Ignat, and become almost as popular at Warsaw as in Brussels, the Prince de Ligne, faithful to his word, arrived at Versailles at the very day 6 months after having left it. And so that is the end of chapter 6.